That time again for Dr. Robert A. Heineman, political science professor emeritus of Alfred University. He's from Illinois. He worked for a while in Washington, D.C., and when it comes to Washington and Albany, he's in the know. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Bob.
Well, thanks for the introduction. Really quite nice. Yes, thank you.
Don't worry, we'll get you as the show goes on, Dr. Bob.
Yes, yes.
Democrats' current strategy for getting Joe Biden in the White House. What do you think their strategy is?
Well, it's quite amazing. It's interesting in the extreme, Brian. Basically, they're going to keep Joe Biden in the basement there as long as they can. And at this point, they're just letting Trump run wild out there on his own. And some of the more recent polls show Biden ahead by a substantial margin over Trump. So as long as it's going that direction, I think there's going to be a real momentum on their part to keep doing what they're doing, which is probably a mistake. But nonetheless, right now, what the target is President Trump, and almost all of Biden's comments and such are aimed at Trump and at Trump personally. So he seems to be running on you folks that hate Trump should be voting for me. And beyond that, he doesn't seem to have much to offer. And, of course, there's a lot of baggage that Joe Biden carries, but the Trump people aren't spending much time on that at all at this point. So it's really quite an interesting campaign on or lack thereof, on the part of the Democrats. And to a certain extent, I think Trump makes it easier for them to be successful in this respect. Now, you really don't have any idea what will happen if we get past this virus epidemic and the economy starts to open. My theory is if we open up the economy here in the next 3 or 4 weeks, it's going to really take off. Now, there are different views on that, but I think basically there's a lot of pent-up demand there, and there's a lot of jobs waiting for people. So we'll see how that plays out. But I think another aspect of this whole approach is, of course, now we're spending a lot of time wondering whom Joe Biden will pick as his VP candidate. And that really is interesting as well, because my theory on that is, which I'm happy to offer to you and the
Sure,
audience.
I was just about to say that.
Sure. Thank you, Brian. My theory on that is that if he picks a fairly strong person, and he's already cornered himself, he has to pick a woman, I guess. But some of these people, like Stacey Abrams, Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren, you're talking about some very strong, opinionated people. And I don't see Joe Biden as being strongly opinionated on much of anything. So I don't know who's running his campaign. I get the feeling that his wife is playing a very important role here. So if Joe picks, any one of those or perhaps another one, I think somewhere during the campaign you're going to see some real differences emerge. And so the VP may well end up pushing an approach or campaign that is divergent from what Joe Biden wants to do. And you could end up with some real decent warfare right within the Democrat Party during the campaign. I think that's a real possibility.
Dr. Bob, when it comes to campaigning, does Trump have any handlers, or is it all Trump making the calls there?
Well, he has, to say that he has handlers, I think would be overstating it. But he does have people he relies on for advice and guidance of one sort or another. And then he does what he thinks he wants to do. And sometimes it comes off pretty half-cocked. On the other hand, a lot of times he says things or does things and you're kind of shaking his head. And then it turns out, in fact, that what what he's done or what he said turns out to be reasonably accurate. So he has his own sense of what people want and what he wants to be as a president, and he's going to stick with that. But it certainly does vary, and of course, you have this whole bureaucracy under him, many of whom I'm sure, have no use for him at all. And so, trying to get something done, especially here with this virus situation, is really quite difficult. And previously, the sorts of things he wanted to get done, cutting back on regulations, cutting back on personnel, you can do that. I mean, they can be as unhappy as they want. The president can go ahead and do this. But in the virus situation, he has to have people who are on board and willing to go out there and go the extra mile to get things put together. And that's where, of course, they're running into problems because Congress has voted these huge amounts of money, and the bureaucracy just doesn't seem to be getting it out in any kind of efficient fashion because, in fact, the bureaucracy, for the most part, is not particularly efficient to start with.
Doc, can I stop you there?
Yeah.
Wasn't Trump the one who said, I want troops out of Syria? And has that happened yet, speaking of bureaucratic resistance?
He has very few troops in Syria right now. I doubt that there's 1,000 over there at this point.
Okay, so finally it's come around that they're getting some of those guys out because he called for that a long time ago.
Yeah, and again, we really have very little idea what's going on in the Middle East. I mean, I think we have troops in the Sinai. I think we have troops in Somalia. We have troops in Iraq. Of course, we have troops in Afghanistan. And we have some troops in... I think the troops in Syria are basically surrounding, I think, an airfield or some oil supplies or something of that sort. And there aren't... I'm thinking I saw the number 800, but there are a few there yet. But basically, as far as I can tell, they're not engaged in any serious military confrontations.
Yeah, because some of those establishment Joint Chief types guys, boy, did they put up a stink when he announced that Trump wanted. When Trump announced he wanted the troops pulled out of Syria, wow, they acted like that was the biggest faux pas of all.
Well, they're approaching things from a different perspective from the president, and I think basically I think has a better sense of what Americans think about the whole thing, and I think in his sense, he's got a better sense of what history has to say about the Middle East there. Not that our military people aren't bright, and the officers, frankly, are really impressive in terms of intelligence and background. But basically what I think the military is being oriented toward right now is the Far East and China and some of the moves China is making over there. And I think the military has kind of decided that if there's going to be a confrontation of any sort, that's where the next one's going to be. So for them and for us, frankly, there's not much in the Middle East of much importance to us. Of course, Israel is important, and there may be other aspects that are important, one of which is to prevent Al-Qaeda or ISIS or some of these other idiots from building bases and using them to attack us from. But we can handle that, and the oil situation, which is one of the reasons why we're highly dependent on some of these countries today, we're in very good shape with regard to oil. So we really don't depend on them like, say, 20, 30 years ago. We certainly were dependent. So it's a different way of looking at things, and the way I read it, the Secretary of Defense agrees that we've got to revamp the military and take a military that can handle confrontations and warfare, I guess. Nobody wants warfare, but at least be able to confront the Chinese in the Far East. So the military presumably has to adapt and move along with that.
Dr. Bob, a story that broke on Thursday afternoon, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit ordered Judge Emmett Sullivan, who's handling the Michael Flynn case, to respond to the appeal to either have him, Judge Sullivan, replace or to dismiss the trial no later than June 1st. What do you make of that?
Well, the attorneys for Flynn appealed to the Court of Appeals because Judge Sullivan is on record as having made a number of really quite biased statements about Flynn and the Flynn case. And I guess he's a pretty acerbic sort of fellow anyway, but nonetheless, the comments in and of themselves show a considerable bias against Flynn and what he's charged with. So his attorneys appealed to the Court of Appeals and said, look, this guy's too highly biased. We want him removed, which they may do. On the other hand, if Flynn just goes, or the Judge Sullivan simply goes ahead and dismisses the case, then the whole issue is moot. So we'll see, but it's not a good sign.
Quick question. PBS did a special the other night on the life of Clarence Thomas. Did you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it was Tuesday night, 2-hour show, and it was really well done. And I think first and foremost, it's really quite unusual for PBS to actually give a conservative a decent coverage. And I really would urge our listeners, if they get a chance, and I'm sure they'll run this again, to listen to it, because it's quite informative, and in its kind of understated way, it shows what a bunch of hypocrites the liberals are. So you've got these liberals on the Senate Judiciary Committee who have spent their time saying what they're going to do for minorities and the poor and the disadvantaged, and then you have this black fellow there in front of them who's telling them basically, you're a bunch of hypocrites. You're attacking me, you're criticizing me because I'm black and I don't talk like black people should be talking, like you think they should be talking.
You talking about Clarence Thomas there?
I'm sorry?
Clarence Thomas.
Yeah, right. And his wife, Jenny, says, and I don't want to go into it too much, but she says, here I am sitting here listening to these guys on the Judiciary Committee, and there's Teddy Kennedy up there going on about the moral issues involved. And she says, I'm looking at him and just shaking my head like, Teddy Kennedy, moral issues?
Well, wasn't his big issue natural law? Or no, you know who I'm thinking? Judge Robert Bork.
Oh, yeah. Well, no, he mentions, and as you know, and as our audience may know, Justice Thomas was kind enough to visit Alfred for 3 days back there in '95 or thereabouts, and had, I think, a really great visit here at the university. And part of that was because of his former speechwriter, Ken Masugi, who's a good friend of mine. And they mentioned Ken there in the program, and the fact that Masugi and Justice Thomas, before he was justice, when he was at the EEOC and the Civil Rights Division, would talk about Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the idea of natural law, and
because for some reason that was a big no-no with Ted Kennedy, the words natural law.
Well, I think Thomas's point is, and I guess his wife's point as well, is that they were all concerned about his position on abortion. And this whole idea of going to natural law was an attempt to somehow get him to say that he opposed abortion, which, of course, he wasn't about to say. So that's what they felt that they were trying to somehow deal with. But it's really interesting because, of course, Thomas visited us way back in '95 or thereabouts, and he is now the senior justice on the Supreme Court. He
like I said in the beginning of the show, Dr. Bob's got connections. By the way, Dr. Bob, I wanted to ask you about that special on PBS about the Clarence Thomas case. Joe Biden, Senator Joe Biden of Delaware at the time, was a very key player in that whole thing. How does that look now? Knowing Joe Biden as we know him right now in 2020, what do you think going back and looking at those clips of Joe Biden back in, what was that, the late 80s, early 90s?
It would have been early 90s, yeah.
How's Biden come across?
To be frank, he looks a heck of a lot smoother then than he does now. There's no two ways about that. And you can see he's trying to manipulate Thomas one way or another. But, Thomas handles it pretty well. The other thing that you could kind of look at here, you could look at the way they treated Thomas, and then you look at something like the whole Brett Kavanaugh thing. I mean, these liberals just don't give it up. So this attempt to dig up somebody who claims this or that, I mean, it's gone back a long way. Anytime they have somebody who has reasonably conservative leanings, they're going to try to dig up somebody who can make charges of one sort or another against them. But it's definitely worth watching, and people can make their own decisions. But I think it's frankly at least worth some praise that PBS actually went out of their way to present a reasonably accurate picture of a conservative position and conservative views.
My big memory of that actually is a Joe Biden line. I remember watching it on TV there at the time, and Joe Biden said about Anita Hill's accusations of sexual harassment against the Supreme Court then Justice nominee Clarence Thomas. Joe Biden said, I have a hard time I don't know if they used this clip in the PBS special, but Senator Biden said, I have a hard time believing Anita Hill's story when you, Justice Thomas, and we know is a fact that you slept in your car so that your child could stay in a private school.
Yeah, well, he may well have said that, and
he did.
As I've mentioned on the program several times ago, when Anita Hill brings up this bit about the pubic hair on the pop can and the other guy, Long Dong Silver or whatever, I called my buddy, his former speechwriter, and said, listen, if you look at the cases that she's teaching at Oral Roberts University, you're going to find those comments out of those cases. And the next day, Orrin Hatch from the committee bench quotes from cases that she's teaching those very examples. So it leads you to think that basically she was trying to draw up any kind of example she could and accuse Thomas of saying those sorts of things, which I thought, really weakened her case. Now, I'm not certain it was my idea there.
Sounds like it was, Dr. Bob. I said you had connections at the beginning of the show. Wow, bigger than I remembered.
Well, well.
Dr. Bob, Congressman Tom Reed, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, put out a statement, maybe it was last week, he put out a statement saying that the nursing homes are overwhelmed with having to do 2 tests a week, testing the staff in nursing homes twice a week for COVID-19 with the swab test. Democratic congressional candidate Tracy Matrano objected to Reed questioning the wisdom of tests twice a week.
Yeah. Well, I think what we have here, and this is something, of course, that is going to go on while we're trying to deal with this crisis. I think this indicates that Cuomo is frankly overreacting to the fact that his treatment of the nursing homes has led to some, clearly to some deaths. And so now he comes down with his edict that you have to test twice a week, which is a real burden on the nursing home staff and everybody involved, and it's costly. And the question is, are the tests out there, and who can do the tests, and all that sort of thing, when I think most people would feel that testing once a week would be plenty. So I think that's what Reed's concern is, but I do think basically you're dealing with an overreaction there on the part of the governor. And I do think this, Brian, we've been suggesting that Governor Cuomo would be a real candidate for the presidential nominations, but I think this whole nursing home thing has hurt him a lot. And so I think maybe we'll have to back off our prediction there a little bit, Brian.
Yeah, every Democrat I've had on says no, it won't be Cuomo. Yes, it will be Biden. Every Democrat I've had on has said that. That leads me to think that you may be onto something there, Dr. Bob.
Yeah. Well, we have to adjust, when times change and things change.
New information comes in.
Yes, indeed.
That's what we're all about here at AM 1480 WLEA and 106.9 FM. Dr. Bob, new information.
Yes. Try to keep our audience reasonably informed, Brian.
Thank you, and we'll talk to you next week.
Gee, I hope so.